Welcome to the other side of the Letby. In episode 81, we're going to have a look again at BBC in the context of the podcast The Trial by Caroline Cheetham and Liz Hull. And this is in light of the revelation on Twitter that Cheshire Police, through Operation Hummingbird, paid a company called the Media Factory Limited. According to a document dated from the 1st of the 7th, 2023, and dated to the 30th of the 9th, 2023, and released by John Dyer, Police and Crime Commissioner for Cheshire, in a PDF that I'll leave the link for, they paid the Media Factory 3 payments for publicity. That was the purpose of the payment, publicity. And the payments were on the 12th of April 2023, £3,950. The exact same payment on the 22nd of the 11th, 2023, and a further exact payment, £3,950, on the 5th of June 2024. And according to Phil Hammond, the medical editor of Private Eye, on Twitter, Phil says that the Media Factory is owned or part owned by Caroline Brewster, Bruster, that's how I'm pronouncing it, also known as Caroline Cheetham. And Caroline Cheetham, along with Liz Hull from the Daily Mail, did 300 episodes of a podcast during the Letby trial and afterwards. But the important bit was during the Letby trial. Now, we have no idea why Cheshire Police paid these 3 payments to the Media Factory. All we know is that the trial did podcast during the trial. The Daily Mail claims ownership of these podcasts, and their ownership is attributed to the podcasts on Apple and all the usual places that you will listen to podcasts. And Liz Hull works for the Daily Mail. In any event, we're going to look in this podcast at one of the trial podcasts, and that would be the cases of BBC and BBD that were in podcast number 5. And this was broadcast on YouTube during the trial. Now, for the record, I cannot find any public record of any qualifications for Liz Hull. I'm not saying she is not qualified. I'm saying that I can't find any qualifications, so I don't know what her education or her educational background is. I can't find any public record of any formal education for Caroline Cheetham either. And that includes her LinkedIn profile and official biographies. But she is a lecturer and a visiting fellow in journalism at the University of Salford. Anyway, I can't find any public record of any education for Caroline Cheetham or Liz Hull, the 2 co-hosts of the Trial podcast. Does that mean that they are not skilled or capable in their roles as journalists? Absolutely not. But it would be nice to know if they had any scientific background, because they're about to embark and we're about to analyse what they said on their podcast. And we'll start with the transcript for episode 5. Now, I'll leave out the nauseating bits, nauseating for me anyway, and cut to the meat of the matter. And Caroline Cheetham introduces herself as a broadcast journalist. And they say 7 of the babies died, 10 survived. The jury is now hearing about each baby in turn. So we're going to focus each episode of this podcast on each baby. What the prosecution say happened to them, when and how, And in each case would explain why the defence said Lucy Letby did not harm or kill any of the babies in her care. For baby C, the when and the how are very important, as we'll see. So they go on, welcome to episode 5, baby C. And they start that baby C was tiny. He weighed less than 2 pounds when he was born by caesarean section 10 weeks early in June 2015. And that's it. So what can we deduce from that? Baby C was male. He was less than 2 pounds at 30 weeks. And he was born by emergency caesarean section. Now, according to Mark MacDonald, Lucy Letby's new lawyer, Justice Goss didn't allow the RCPCH report into evidence because, according to Mark, Justice Goss said it was full of hearsay. But we know the contents of the RCPCH report. So straight away, without looking at the report, we know from a study called the Epicure study that the mortality risk for baby C, because it was born in a level 2 unit compared to a level 3 unit, in general, the mortality risk was 1.43 times higher, which means an absolute risk of 9%. So for every 100 babies born in the Countess of Cheshire Hospital compared to similar babies born in a level 3 unit, 9 more will die in the level 2 unit compared to the level 3 unit. And that's before we take into account any of the failings of the Countess of Cheshire Hospital. Now, we could go through again all of the failings of the Countess of Cheshire Hospital, but we don't need to. We will just go through the failings in terms of staff. And the report found, the RCPCH report found, that there was only one nurse per 4 to 6 high dependency infants versus 1 to 1 or 1 to 2 in a level 3 unit, and that there was no 24/7 medical neonatal consultant rota in the Countess of Cheshire Hospital, and there were huge tier 2 rota gaps, that's the junior doctor gaps, so they had no specific roster and therefore permanent presence of dedicated neonatal doctors at the Countess of Cheshire Hospital. So if we look at that in the light of the Epicure study, in a standard issue, bog standard, level 3 unit, baby C's mortality risk was 21%. And if we compare that to a typical level 2 unit, that rises to 30%. That's the 9% difference. But when we add in the additional problems of the Countess of Cheshire Hospital, that rises to 40 to 50% mortality prediction, which is a 2.4 times higher mortality risk than national benchmarks for 30-week infants of extreme low birth weight like baby C. Now, we know also that the ward or the unit was contaminated with Pseudomonas and S. multifida. So if we chuck known risk factors associated with those two contaminations and failure to control the sterility of the ward, where do we get to now on the risk analysis? We now jump to between 55 and 65% probability of mortality for that baby C, once the decision was taken to have the baby born in the Countess of Cheshire Hospital and keep the baby born in the Countess of Cheshire Hospital. And I'll leave you the calculations for all this stuff. So what Liz and Caroline don't tell their audience in the very opening statement is what I just told you, that the decision to keep baby C in the Countess of Cheshire Hospital put the risk of mortality for baby C above 55% and approaching 65%. So the podcast carries on that the nurse looking after baby C described him as the smallest baby she had ever seen. and that there had been problems with the mother's pregnancy, which meant blood flow to the placenta was abnormal, and this had restricted his growth in the womb. And so he was only half the size he should have been for his gestation. So the girls are inaccurate there. He was not less than half the size he should have been. He was about 43% smaller than he should have been. But we don't go by absolute weight alone when we're calculating risk. We go by centiles. So a centile basically tells you what each percentage of the total population represents. So if you're on the 50th centile of a population, for example, weight, about half of all babies born at that gestation, 30 weeks, will be a certain weight. In the case of baby C, the baby was below the third centile, which means that only 3% of babies born at 30 weeks would be the weight 800 grams. And when we apply the risk multiplier to the lowest 3%, the lowest centile below 3, we get severe growth restriction, and we now multiply the probability of deaths in that unit to between 70% and 85%. So we're not even 5 minutes into Liz Hull and Caroline Cheetham's so-called podcast, and we have failed to inform the audience, and therefore the defense had failed to inform the jury that the choices made in the care of BBC have left us in a situation where we're approaching 100% certainty for mortality as the outcome of the birth of BBC at the Countess of Chester Hospital. And then the podcast carries on revealing the true ignorance and the level of ignorance of these people, and also, therefore, what the jury was told about neonatal mortality when they say doctors actually were worried he might be stillborn. So despite his size, he was delivered early at 30 weeks. No, ladies, because of his size, he was delivered at 30 weeks. Because he was absolutely going to be stillborn, he was born at 30 weeks. So in utero, before he was born, his risk of mortality was extremely high, and he would never have made it beyond 30 weeks. And then they carry on. Now, he was immediately placed in Nursery 1, and we've heard in previous episodes that Nursery 1 was where the most vulnerable babies were cared for at the Countess. But even from birth, he was described by Sophie Ellis, who is the nurse looking after him, as a feisty little baby because he was active, wriggling around and pulling out his tubes. So although he was tiny, weighing less than the bag of sugar, the prosecution said BBC was doing well. Well, I've just told you what his mortality risk was, upwards of 85% certainty. So how can he be doing well? I can also tell you that feisty is not a medical term, and therefore shouldn't be used and should not have been allowed in court. Feisty can mean anything, but it certainly does not indicate that the baby was vigorous, as these people are trying to imply. And the baby most definitely was not doing well. And they carry on. That's right, the jury had heard that he didn't require resuscitating at birth, and although he had a few problems, he had some breathing difficulties, and he was being treated for pneumonia. The doctors actually thought that he was getting better. In fact, he was considered stable enough for his breathing support to be reduced and for them to start feeding him. Okay, so let's feed some of that into our little risk calculator, shall we? Now, this puts us up to the 90% or 88% mortality risk certainty for BBC at this point when he's arrived at Nursery 1 just after birth with the conditions that these two clowns have just described. But we'll jump all that just like we did with the jury, and we'll go on with the podcast. But on the evening of June the 13th, 2015, BBC suddenly collapsed and he died. And just to keep up with the timeline here, Liz, this was 4 nights after the collapse of BBB and 5 nights after the collapse of BBA, which only serves to confirm that BBC was already in a high-risk environment, something the defence didn't go near. And at this point, I'm going to say something that I meant to say for a long time, or I'm going to ask the question I meant to ask for a long time. Why did the defence not put forward the information I'm putting forward now as a general practitioner researching medical documents and using basic mathematics? Did Mike Hall, the defense expert, not know about these risk factors? Or did the defense decide not to use this information to inform the jury of the risks this baby was running simply by being in the wrong place at the wrong time? Why did Mike Hall not state these risks? And why has Mike Hall not given any meaningful interviews or participated in the multiple outlets like podcasts, interviews, etc., about what he thought of the Lucy Letby trial? He has stated that he didn't think it was fair, but that's it. So returning to this podcast, what were the chances that the BBC would have a collapse 4 days after birth in these circumstances? Well, we know that the collapse was expected because we have a 90% certainty of mortality. So let's have a quick look at the Journal of Pediatrics from 1999, just to show how well known all of this stuff is. And the objective of this article was to present primary and secondary causes of death confirmed by autopsy for extremely low birth weight infants, BBC. And this involved a total of 111 infants weighing between 300 and 1,000 grams who died in this hospital in a 4-year period, 1990 to 1993, and retrospectively reviewed. And the results showed that infection was the most common primary cause, 56 out of 111 babies, followed by respiratory distress syndrome, bronchopulmonary dysplasia, 24 out of 111. So 80 of the babies died from the two conditions that this baby had, BBC. And the conclusion, infection of the amniotic fluid leading to pneumonia was the major cause of death in the extremely low birth weight infants. Accurate causes of death cannot be reliably ascertained without an autopsy accompanied by examination of the placenta in the early deaths. Antibiotic treatment for the mother and infant may have reduced the deaths from infection. Early failure to respond to neonatal intensive care may indicate the presence of congenital pneumonia. What is so unexpected and unexplained about the death of BBC, Caroline and Liz? So returning to the podcast. So Liz, take us back to the hours after BBC was born. We have heard in previous episodes that the system of care at the Countess was for each baby to have a designated nurse. The jury has heard that on the night shift of June the 13th, Lucy Letby was not the designated nurse for BBC. In fact, the shift leader had assigned her to Nursery 3, where another baby boy who can't be named and isn't involved in the trial was showing signs of respiratory distress. She wanted Lucy Letby, who was by then an experienced Band 6 nurse, to keep a close eye on him. And then Liz chips in. So Lucy Letby was in Nursery 3 on the night shift of June the 13th. and BBC's designated nurse was called Sophie Ellis. Now, she was newly qualified and she hadn't had any specialist training, and she was assigned to look after BBC under the supervision of a more experienced nurse called Melanie Taylor, and that was in nursery room 1. And at 11 o'clock that night, Sophie Ellis gave BBC his first milk feed, which was 0.5 mil. That's right, isn't it? Says Liz. Yes, says Caroline. Obviously that's a tiny amount, but the doctors had held off giving BBC any milk at all until then because nurses had aspirated, which basically means drawn out some dark black bile from his stomach through his feeding tube in the hours previous. So they weren't unduly concerned, but they had decided to keep an eye on him and feed him intravenously rather than giving him milk straight away. But the jury heard that by that evening, doctors were happy with his progress and decided that feeds could begin. Oh dear. Now, number 1, this is not a feed. 0.5 mils is what's called a trophic feed. It's not a feed, but we now discover that the baby is looked after by a non-qualified nurse, while the qualified nurse is looking after a less sick baby somewhere else, and that the baby has been aspirating bile. So let's pump that into our little risk calculator, shall we? We have to remember that for BBC, there was no meconium, there was bile staining for 3 days, and nobody did a damn thing about it. Also, we know that Dr. Gibbs didn't see the baby, so we have all of the clinical indicators of bowel obstruction, abdominal distension, vomiting or aspiration of bile, and the black suggests bleeding as well. So we're going to have a lot of synergistic risk factors at play here now for mortality, and we can estimate the mortality upwards of now 97%. Not a kick in the ass of 100% certainty for mortality. So how can anyone be found guilty of the murder of a baby that has a 97% probability of dying using risk adjustment metrics? So the podcast carries on in its wisdom. So it was 15 minutes after the first feed from Sophie Ellis at 11 p.m. that night that BBC stopped breeding. Yes, she told the jury that she had nipped out of the nursery for just a few moments. She couldn't remember exactly how long she was away, but she said it wasn't very long, and then returned when she heard the alarm go off. Now, this was the alarm that was monitoring BBC's breathing and heart rate. And when she came back into nursery 1, she said Lucy Letby was there, standing over BBC's incubator. Sophie Ellis said Lucy Letby had told her that BBC had just had a bradycardia and a desat, which in layman's terms means his heart rate had dropped and the oxygen levels in his blood had fallen. But what our two clowns don't seem to realise is it was the monitor, not Lucy Letby, that informed the staff, all of the staff, that the baby had had the bradycardia and the desat, which was, as we've just said, totally expected and totally explainable. And because we're now up on 97% chance of mortality, the baby shouldn't have been in the Countess of Chester Hospital at that stage, something that was discussed during the trial, but it wasn't emphasised by the defence, including the defence expert, Mike Hall. Why is he not sitting there telling the jury that there was a 97% chance this was going to happen, and that when a baby has a bradycardia and a desat, in these circumstances, it would not be at all unexpected. It is totally explainable, and every nurse who hears that alarm going off would respond, particularly if they knew that the inexperienced and untrained nurse who was left to look after the baby, had nipped out. So the podcast carries on. Okay, but he recovered actually quickly at that point, didn't he? Without any intervention, and his breathing returned to normal on its own. And I think the jury was told Sophie Ellis went to work on a computer in the same room. It was in nursery room 1 opposite BBC's cot. Now, Liz, could she see him? That is, could the designated nurse see the baby she was designated to see? No. Sophie Ellis said she had her back to BBC's cot, but then 15 minutes later, he collapsed again. She turned away from the computer to attend BBC, and she said she saw Lucy Letby at his cot side again. Begging the question, why was the designated nurse not at the cot side where she was designated to be? And why did it take 15 minutes to put information onto a computer? And the podcast carries on. And Liz, he had stopped breathing again, but this time he didn't recover on his own. No, he didn't, says Liz, and the shift leader, who's a nurse we can't name for legal reasons, rushed in to help. Sophie Ellis and Lucy Letby tried to give BBC rescue breaths with an oxygen mask, but he didn't respond. So Sophie Ellis was sent to put out a crash call. That's the emergency call to the doctor on duty to come urgently. So I think at this point, says Liz or Caroline, I don't know, I'm reading this from a script, a number of nurses were doing CPR, but it wasn't working, and the court heard that it was Lucy Letby who suggested using a tube. Now, this is called a Guidel tube, and that was to open BBC's airways. Well, number one, girls, a Guidel tube is not a tube. It's a little plastic device that's used to hold the tongue out of the way and clear the airway. And isn't it at all surprising that the designated nurse has already been sent off to fetch the cavalry, and it was Lucy Letby that suggested the appropriate use of the Guidel airway, which is not a tube? Why did the supervisor of the unqualified nurse not immediately reach for the Guidel airway, as nearly everyone else would? Yet another mystery, not solved by the trial podcast. Oh, we're about to get an answer to that mystery. Nurse Taylor, the nurse that was supervising the unqualified Sophie Ellis, said she had never used such a device before. And she described Lucy Letby as being cool and very calm as the situation unfolded. And the two clients doing this podcast don't realise that's because Lucy Letby was trained and that she likely had used a Guidel airway before, which is all the more reason that she should have been put in charge of BBC from the very beginning. It was around 11 minutes after BBC collapsed that the doctor on duty, Catherine Davis, arrived. 11 minutes to respond to an emergency bleep for a collapse of a preterm baby in a neonatal nursery. 11 minutes, but the baby didn't respond as he should have, according to these people, to proper resuscitation methods. But proper resuscitation methods don't include the doctor arriving 11 minutes into the actual arrest. They don't include the shift supervisor not knowing how to use a Guidel airway, nor to have the designated nurse unqualified for the task before her. Now, by this point, said the girls on the podcast breathlessly, it was 11:26. Unlike in the cases of baby A and baby B, one of the nursing team rushed to get baby's mother. Now, she's a doctor herself, actually. She's a GP, and she was recovering from her cesarean section on a ward upstairs. Yeah, that's right, Caroline. The mother of BBC arrived in Nursery 1 and saw doctors and nurses desperately trying to save her son. The jury will read a statement she gave to the police afterwards. Her words have been voiced by an actor. And part of the words that this doctor gave in evidence was that it was explained that BBC's heart rate had suddenly dropped and he had stopped breathing without any reason. He had pneumonia and respiratory distress syndrome. Those are two common reasons why babies will stop breathing. He was 10 weeks premature. That's another reason why babies will stop breathing. And he had severe intrauterine growth restriction, which means that his brain and respiratory center were not properly developed, which is another reason why he will stop breathing. And the girls carry on. This had been sudden and very unexpected. They had given him a very small amount of milk a few minutes before, but they didn't think this was relevant. No, girls, it wasn't relevant. The pneumonia, the respiratory distress syndrome, the uterine growth restriction, the prematurity, the lack of monitoring, the absence of senior doctors, the absence of junior doctors, the presence of untrained and inexperienced nurses, and the location in an understaffed level 2 unit were the reasons. You're right, it had nothing to do with the trophic feed. And to show you what a professional outfit the Countess at Chester Hospital was, the doctor, this mother, goes on to say that it was explained to her by a nurse, not a doctor. It was explained to her by a nurse that the baby was going to die. And the two clowns doing the podcast go on. This piece of information came from a nurse rather than a doctor, and I think it became clear shortly after midnight, Liz, that baby C couldn't be saved. But unusually, he survived for 5 more hours, eventually dying at 5:58 a.m. on June the 14th. And this detail is particularly distressing, Liz. Yeah, the registrar and consultant who tried to help baby C told jurors his response to resuscitation attempts was actually very unusual. Dr. Davis said the baby didn't have a heartbeat when she arrived, and despite his prematurity, he thought it was very unusual that he did not respond at all. Well, let me put you right, girls, and maybe you'll take your podcast down when I put you right. The likelihood of survival for this baby at that point of a cardiac arrest that took a doctor 11 minutes to get to is less than 1%. Survival in the normal course of events plummets after 10 minutes of CPR, by which stage the doctor hadn't even arrived. There is a little rule called the golden 5-minute rule for neonatal resuscitation. So this is just part of the Lucy Letby fairy tale. There was no expectation that these babies would survive CPR. None. And I'll leave you the links to all of that if you want to go into it yourself. But the truth is, and again, why did Michael Hall not tell the jury that the truth was that the golden 5 minutes had been breached by twice the duration, and that the UK neonatal registry data shows a 0% survival rate for extremely low birth weight babies with more than 10 minutes CPR delay in units lacking 24/7 consultant coverage. And we know that the CPR and the resuscitation measures taken in the absence of Lucy Letby would have been even worse, because she was the only one that knew what a guide LROI was. And Dr. Davies told the jury, according to Liz and Caroline, the experts that are giving the evidence here in the trial podcast, that even the smallest, sickest babies will usually respond in some way, even if only for a brief period of time. What does that even mean? There are 2 outcomes to resuscitation from cardiac arrest: return of spontaneous circulation or death. The rest is meaningless. And I've talked about this before. Dr. Gibbons then go on to say, couldn't explain this. And he couldn't explain this despite this being a phenomenon seen in between 17 and 23% of neonatal resuscitation cases with severe underlying pathology, such as pneumonia. It's called the Lazarus, Lazarus phenomenon, which is well known, and I talk about it in my book, but it represents another lie told to the jury in the Letby trial. And again, where was Mike Hall to correct this? So let's carry on with the endless stream of misinformation. The word these people like to use when it isn't them saying it. Everything they say is information. Everything people like me say is misinformation. But it's actually the other way around. Yeah, the shift leader told the court that she had to remind Lucy Letby more than once to concentrate on her designated baby and come out of the room where BBC's parents were cradling him in his final moments. And why was that? That was because Sophie Alice was so upset, because she was so inexperienced and emotional in a situation like this, that she had to abandon the room. And it is not at all unusual that when something like that happens, a more senior nurse or a more senior doctor will stay with the parents. But the shift leader, who didn't know what a Guidel Irway was, says she told Lucy Letby to get out of the room. Now, you will recall that Justice Goss said that the report from the RCPCH was full of hearsay. Well, will anyone tell me why what this nurse said, this shift leader said about Lucy Letby, wasn't hearsay? And the podcast goes on. Afterwards, a post-mortem was carried out at Alderhead Children's Hospital, and I think his death was initially put down to natural causes. Yes, but when Dowie Evans, that's the prosecution expert witness that we've told listeners about previously, examined BBC's medical notes and the reports from other clinicians, he concluded that the death was actually not natural. The prosecution said this was the first time Lucy Letby killed the baby by injecting her not into the bloodstream, a technique that they say she had used before, but instead directly into his stomach via a feeding tube. Dr. Evans told the jury that this inflated his stomach like a balloon, causing his diaphragm to splint and not work properly, eventually causing him to suffocate. And Dowie Evans' presence in the court and his behaviour in the court is where the case of BBC begins to fall apart. The defence, as I've just pointed out, was appalling. The expert advice that Ben Myers received was appalling. And the two clowns in this podcast, they refer to Ben Myers as defending Lucy Letby, and he suggested to the jury that BBC was so small and it was borderline whether he should have been treated at the Countess. Well, I just told you why he shouldn't have been. That he should have been moved to a specialist hospital where his mortality odds would have increased by the amount that I'm showing you in the show notes. So it's beyond question that he should have been moved. Ben Myers questioned whether a nurse as inexperienced as Sophie Alice should have been left in charge of a baby this sick. Answer, no. And Mr. Myers also said that Lucy Letby disputed Sophie Alice and Mel Taylor's recollections that she was in nursery room 1 when BBC suffered his fatal collapse, which tells me that there's no record of that being the case. And if there is no record, then this is nothing but hearsay evidence as well as the RCPCH report. And I think, says one of these two, that Mr. Myers also insisted that it was impossible to exclude infection for the reasons for baby's collapse because he was being treated for pneumonia. So in this podcast, they think that was the case. They were at the trial, but they don't know. They think that was the case. And then they carry on. Yes, and he also suggested that error, which could be seen in his small intestine on an X-ray taken a day before his death, and bile that was aspirated from his feeding tube indicated that BBC had a blockage in his bowel. But this theory was discounted in court by Dr. Gibbs and the prosecution's expert witness, Dr. Evans and Dr. Sandy Bowen, who examined his medical notes after he died. Yes, they said that if the infant had a blockage, it would have been evident at post-mortem after his death. And of course, the two clowns doing this trial broadcast are too stupid and illiterate about medicine to know that that's not true. And I go into great detail about this in my book. There are basically two types of obstruction: mechanical obstruction and functional obstruction. And the functional obstruction will not show at postmortem. So these people either don't know that or they're misleading the jury. Again, where was the defense expert to explain why functional obstruction was highly likely in the case of BBC? And I dedicate a whole chapter to this and the contortions and lies and deceit and deception of Darry Evans trying to get this over the line. None of it dealt with in this trial podcast. The two clowns in this podcast don't tell you that the postmortem finding to the death of BBC was widespread hypoxic ischemic damage to the heart and myocardium due to lung disease, not due to error in the nasogastric tube splinting the diaphragm, due to lung disease. They don't tell you also that Dr. Marnarides agreed with the original postmortem findings. But then he changed his mind on the stand too after an expert meeting where this error via the nasogastric tube BS theory was invented. The two clowns in the trial podcast don't tell you that Darry Evans had to invent a second disease, subacute splinting of the diaphragm, because the X-ray taken was taken on the 12th that showed the massive dilatation in the stomach and the small intestine coming from the functional obstruction on the 12th of June when Lucy Letby wasn't present. And then Evans, when he took the stand, realised he was caught out and tried to maintain the fiction that somehow Lucy Letby was able to top up with an extra dollop of air this functional obstruction and cause the splinting, which led to post-mortem findings that were due to lung disease. The whole thing is a fiction and a fallacy, and the trial podcast is a joke. And there now seems to be some kind of tenuous link between Operation Hummingbird and the actual podcast. But we don't know. We can only speculate. We can't say for sure until the Daily Mail comes clean. The Daily Mail produced that podcast. Caroline Cheetham was a part of that podcast and is also part of the Media Factory. Operation Hummingbird paid the Media Factory the monies that we have just described. It all seems rather confusing. Now, Dr. Marnarides agreed with the original findings of the post-mortem. So we have two independent findings of death by natural causes, one of which was reinterpreted by the invention of a disease by Darry Evans that he has since withdrawn. Now, these journalists, podcasters, actually won an award for this work. What does that say about journalistic standards today? Now, it was hardly the Pulitzer Prize, but for me, the Lucy Letby trial goes much wider than Lucy herself. It represents, to me, a rot in society as a whole, and in particular the abandonment of reason and science. and its substitution for fakery, shamanism and voodoo. And it's not unusual that these things happen in society at the end of an era, like the end of empire. And this zeitgeist shift in society often precedes catastrophic events in society like wars or famines or financial collapses that are typical of end of empire. And this is a retreat to comforting and infantile narratives when systemic complexity tends to overwhelm the problem-solving capacity of society. And it is so evident in the trial of Lucy Letby. So much so that in order to get Letby's conviction over the line, we have to invent diseases. We can't even analyse the diseases that we know about. We have to invent new ones. And then we have podcasts like The Trial to explain it all for us as if we were 4-year-olds, which is the intellectual equivalent on display in that podcast. Now, I would be very happy to debate Liz Hull or Caroline Cheetham anywhere, any day, on why nearly everything they said in their podcast is a pile of crap. And we'll finish this article with a nice piece from the New Statesman magazine entitled "The Daily Mail's Lucy Letby podcast makes for queasy listening. It's pious concern masking voyeuristic excitement. The in-depth trial coverage is typical of true crime entertainment." When the jury reached a verdict in the trial of Lucy Letby, now convicted of murdering 7 babies in her time as a neonatal nurse at the Countess of Cheshire Hospital, there was a flurry of media interest. The distressing story provoked page after page of newspaper coverage, hours of rolling broadcasts. A panorama documentary, Lucy Letby, the nurse who killed, was shown on BBC One just hours after her guilt was decided by the court. And multiple podcast series offered updates on the trial, including short, factual bulletins from BBC Merseyside and the Daily Mail's The Trial of Lucy Letby, which has released close to 60 episodes since October last year, and has continued publishing content since the trial came to a close. And I think they're up to 300 now. This series, hosted by the journalists Liz Hull and Caroline Cheetham, positions itself as a contemporary form of court reporting, but is also in the business of turning a live story into what we might queasily call true crime entertainment. This is a podcast, in quotations, about one of the most anticipated criminal trials for years. It involves the most shocking of crimes. So runs the introduction to each episode. Anticipated is a word more commonly applied to a buzzy new novel or a blockbuster movie. This register, pious concern masking voyeuristic excitement, furrowing one's brow while licking one's lips, would be familiar to anyone who has encountered a true crime series in the past. The series attempts to present itself as public service dealing strictly in facts. An early episode explains, "We should say the reason we're doing this is because a court case like this is so detailed, so vast, that there's no way a single news report or a broadcast piece can contain all the information that we're going to hear over the course of the next several months. And this is determined by this hand-rubbing tone." That's what the New Statesman says. "The dangling of each piece of evidence as it is presented in court encourages the listener to position themselves as detective. It's a deeply uncomfortable listen in every sense. It's also a deeply inaccurate listen in every sense, just like the entire Lucy Letby trial." If you haven't listened to it, I would advise you to pick one episode and give it a listen, and then put it beside the facts as they would be or should be interpreted by someone who has a general education in medicine and biology not a specialist education in it. You don't require that. And to think there is a possibility, I don't know, but there is a possibility that the male received payment from the police to make this crap while the trial was still ongoing. I sincerely hope that's not true. And I do hope that the Daily Mail corrects this misconception. Personally, I wouldn't read the Daily Mail anyway, but that's besides the point. As I say, I deal with the case of BBC in particular in great detail in the book that I've just published, because it is so egregious when it comes to the practice of medicine, and indeed the integrity of medicine. And we have covered BBC's death in these podcasts and Dr. Evans' evidence before. So I hope you got something from this. I'm still as pissed off as ever, and I have no doubt that Lucy Letby will be exonerated, because there is no evidence against her except that which is contained in the trial and invented by Darry Evans. So God knows what's going to come up next. This is a trial that isn't going to go away. So we'll leave it there, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.